I am not a very big fan of role passives, and I don't think that is a very unpopular opinion. But I don't think that they're terrible in theory. I think we just kind of need to execute these abilities a little better. So, what you guys are looking at before I get into this whole thing is that this is my opinion about how well the individual passives affect the characters that are, they affect, right? So, how effectively they can utilize these passives. And I'm not going to go into all the specifics here, but basically, the larger point, and kind of everybody knows this, is that some characters largely benefit from these way more than others. So, some characters feel like they kind of get left in the dark, and other characters feel like they are always powerful because of these passive changes, right? Like all of these role passes make some characters much better. So the beginning of this video, I'm going to go through those. I'm going to go through these lists a little bit and just kind of talk about like the individual passives and like how effective they are for certain roles and for certain characters in them. And then the second half of this video, I am going to go into some extra solutions and differences that I would make to passives in general, because I don't think they want to get rid of these multi-character passives altogether. And I think they like the idea of the role passives in theory, but I have a couple ideas about how we could change them up a little bit and make them more engaging and less frustrating, and also like actually usable. Like every character could in theory have a usable passive. So starting with the front end here. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to start with this tank knockback passive. Now, as you can see, I think it's a pretty even distribution. Obviously, this is kind of arbitrary. It's all my opinion. But, in general, characters that need to get in or struggle to get in, like dive characters, right? They need to use their mobility to get closer, and they can be disrupted in it. They are going to benefit the most from these knockback changes because they don't have as many factors to worry about when trying to get in. And it's debatable about which ones benefit more. I have Diva and Doomfist not benefiting as much because I think their mobility is either not as touched by it, or they have more mobility options to where they can get back, and they don't have as many committal abilities, unlike maybe like a Winston or a Wrecking Ball, where if you get some of your really big abilities or your important ones like Jump or Slam knocked back, then it is kind of GG's, right? So the knockback passive helps those characters in particular. You'll also see that Roadhog, I think, is affected by these very much so. One, just because not being able to be booped back while he does his hook combo just makes his damage way more effective to initiate. And also, Roadhog just hook completely ignores the tank knockback passive, so you're ignoring the knockback passive in multiple ways, and he just gets all this unlimited damage with very little counterplay, at least from a knockback standpoint. The characters that don't benefit from this knockback passive are ones that basically already have knockback resistance either built in, like Ori or Mauga, and they don't necessarily have to be super close all the time, or Sigma, who is not really playing, he's more mid-range, and nothing that booping Sigma is really going to do anything. In fact, even if you boop him off the edge, he could probably come back if he has his ult, if he really wants to. So that is kind of like the knockback passive, right? The tank headshot passive affects tanks that are going to have trouble getting in because they have a lack of mobility, but also a lack of mitigation as well. It also helps tanks stay in fights longer, so eventually if they run out of ways to mitigate, or if they have a different condition in the middle of the fight, it'll help them stay just a little longer. So you'll see that there are more characters I think this benefits the most. In fact, I think it obviously benefits all characters in this category to some degree. It's not really like the knockback where it's like, well, who cares if Arisa gets knocked back, right? But for somebody like, that basically everybody in the tank headshots, knockback or headshot reduction is probably going to help, I guess, other than Wrecking Ball. But, the characters that want this are the characters that don't directly mitigate any damage. So, like Junker Queen, Mauga, Ramatra because of Nemesis form, Roadhog, and Zarya, which, bubbles you mitigate damage, but also they pop pretty easily, and their uptime is pretty low overall. Basically, these characters, it gives them more of a fighting chance trying to get to the fight with resources before having to get knocked away, right? Like, basically, it keeps these characters in the fight, and it even allows them to get there sometimes. Other characters, basically the ones that don't benefit from this at all are characters that mitigate the damage very effectively while they're getting in, or even mid-fights, like Reinhardt and Sigma. Reinhardt's debatable. I think he gets a little more of it while he's swinging his shield, but Sigma, again, he has a lot of damage mitigation. He's not really taking too much overall. And Wrecking Ball, whose head is largely unexposed. In terms of the ult charge change, I think most tanks benefit from this in some way. If you're unfamiliar, this is just tanks generate less ult charge. Very similar to the headshot ones, characters with less direct mitigation and more health, which is the big difference, are the ones that are going to benefit from the ult charge changes. So Mauga, Orisa, Ramatra, Roadhog, Wrecking Ball, these are all characters that take a lot of damage, but will also, they also have a lot of health, so they would technically be generating more ult charge. And then the characters that don't have the mitigation, or have just other mitigations, you're always shooting every character, right? Again, I think the only one arguably here that doesn't really benefit from this is Sigma. Maybe this is a sign to show that Sigma is very well designed overall and doesn't need any extra help. Moving on to the DPS here. The DPS passive, of course, is the new-ish damage reduction when you hit them. Now, the reason why the damage reduction is good is that you can continue to keep it up. So even though it goes away after 2 seconds, many characters can keep the pressure up and keep the damage reduction coming. Characters like, very fast fire rates, high uptime. Bastion, Echo. Echo's kind of arguable, but she's got good spam and good far and close pressure. Pharah has really good splash damage from a distance. Sojourn, Soldier, also high damage from a distance. High frequency of damage, right? Tracer can pepper you from across the map, really easy. Characters that are not going to benefit from this as much are ones where you're not going to be hitting as many shots, or it's less effective to just spam and try and do all of that. So Hanzo, Junkrat, Symmetra, even, unless you're super duper close to her and taking a brawl, it's hard for her to consistently hit those orbs. Widowmaker, of course, snipers, right? There's a couple of middle ground ones where, they have relatively high uptimes and range and all of that, but don't get as much out of everything. So you're noticing that one of these roles is gone, right? And the reason why is because support, well, in my opinion, every single support benefits from their passive, where their the healing regen kicks in earlier. The reason why is that this benefits everybody. Any character could have this one, and that would benefit them in some way, because just how the game of Overwatch works, taking cover, all of that, there are some characters, maybe arguably the tanks that really want to get in the fight, maybe wouldn't benefit from this nearly as much, but it's always a nice to have. But the supports who are always trying to play their life, that is what supports really want to do in Overwatch 2, it's play their life and add to the DPS pressure. They're going to be able to do that more effectively with this passive. And of course, everybody wants to play their life. I mean, at the end of the day, having more people on the field will always help. The reason I bring this up at the end and I say anyone could benefit from this is because there is... How do I say this? Let's talk about passives in general, right? Passives, these role passives, they're a way to balance the roles, right? They want to use these passives to help the role in general become better or worse, right? Than other roles per se. The support passive, it's there to just make supports all better, right? Like it is objectively like a good thing for all of them to have. So support, I feel like it's the only passive that actually has done its job, basically saying it makes supports more survivable, more self-sufficient, and it keeps them in the fight, and everybody benefits from it in some form or fashion. The rest of them are not as successful in that regard. And so the tank one, there's literally like 3 different tank passives because they all affect different characters in different ways. And again, Sigma, in my opinion, like there's one character that doesn't even really benefit from any of these. So kind of like, what's the point, right? Like, why does this character even have these abilities? Like, you try and go for a knockback kill on Sigma, and now he's just like not falling off the map, but like that's kind of it, right? Like it's kind of like why not reward some other interactions with these characters just because like Sigma just has these abilities because he's a tank. So going into the second part here, I think we need to shift our focus away from role passives into what I'm going to kind of dub shared passives. Basically what this is instead of passives being, what's it called, designed to make roles, like whole groups of roles, better or worse, they should be a way to balance individual characters. So there's multiple ways to do this, in my opinion. So either the role passives could go to everyone in the role like they already do, and then in characters that they really need it, they could have an extra greater or lesser effect depending. So take, for instance, like if they really want the dive tanks to not get knocked back as much, then characters like Winston wrecking, like all characters in the tank role, numbers are arbitrary here. It's just to keep things in line about what I'm trying to say. All characters in the tank role will have a 30% knockback reduction. But Diva, Doomfist, Winston, Wrecking Ball, arbitrary group of dive tanks, all have 50%, right? So other characters aren't just randomly much more, like, less affected by the things that don't really matter to them as much. And we'll get into all of some extra, like, weird interactions with it. But that is one way I think they could do it, to, like, actually make it more effective for the characters who have these abilities, right? So it's less so that we're just giving all these characters really, really powerful abilities. We're giving them what they need a little more than the other characters. Even though, again, like, it is a role passive, so everyone's going to get some effect from it, these characters may get a little more. I think that's a little hard to keep track of and a little weird when you're actually playing with it. So the other option is just, what if the role passives didn't affect every single character in that role, right? Like, why does Sigma need a headshot reduction? Why not just not have that on him, right? What are the characters, again, we're assuming that Blizzard wants to, just make what these characters want to do more effective. So characters like Mauga or Junker Queen or Ramatra, they would have the headshot reduction, and the characters that don't really need it wouldn't, right? That's kind of like a balance thing, right? It makes the characters more distinct from one another, and also it gives the characters the tools that they would need, and the characters that don't really need it, they don't need to worry about that. Again, it makes certain interactions more fun, right? Like, I think it's more fun to try and boop tanks or try and headshot tanks, but when every single tank is getting all the production from everything, it kind of homogenizes the role a little bit, in my opinion, and makes fighting against it a little less fun. So reducing the amount of things in the role that affects every individual character will introduce back some of that more fun interaction with those characters, right? Now, that is like the one thing that if Blizzard is gung-ho about role passives, right, I feel like those are some interesting types of things to look for about changing them and making them a little more engaging, a little more thought out, a little more fun, right? It's not one big Band-Aid, it's a series of miniature Band-Aids. Maybe we'll call them stitches, right? We're stitching it back together. Now, the other thing that they could do, and I think I would like to see this more, is that why do these passives have to be stuck to certain roles, right? So going off of the idea that we are only certain groups of heroes will get one passive, right? Why does it have to be for a certain role? I mean, like, I think Bastion could greatly benefit from the headshot reduction, right? Something like that. Or even the ult charge reduction, right? Any character, I talked about again, any character really could benefit from the support passive. The DPS passive, I think there are certain tanks or even maybe certain supports that that would be really good for them, right? Like, imagine if D.Va had it. That'd be a lot, but I'm just saying, like, imagine if D.Va is a weaker character, and we want to give her some sort of niche back or some more different playmaking potential. What if we gave D.Va the DPS passive? And now she can effectively do her job as a higher damage dealer, without that tank busting that she used to have, right? It gives her more of a niche within her role, and makes her more effective at doing her job. It kind of brings some extra playmaking and fun to the character while, again, keeping the job as the tank intact a little bit. Now, there is, in my opinion, there is some struggle to figure out how to distribute these. Or I guess, before I get into that point, it's all about balance, right? The idea here is that these are balance tools, right? If a character has the passive or not, that goes into their balance. I think when you have it only confined to the roles, then you have to balance around the passive, right? But if any character could have any of the passives that they make up, and again, it doesn't have to be these in particular, it could be new ones, it could be changed, like the numbers could be changed, anything. But if any character could have it, now the fact that they do have it becomes a balancing tool, right? That is another knob to give somebody. Certain characters are performing a little too well. Maybe they really don't need that, I'm going to call it the DPS passive, but maybe they don't need that DPS passive. Maybe that's just too much for that character, right? Maybe Tracer doesn't need the DPS passive. Again, like that could be a way to nerf Tracer without making her unfun or taking away the stuff that makes her fun, right? Or you know what I mean? It's a way to tune down characters that are too good that we also just don't want to ruin their kits, right? These passives are always extras. None of these passives make characters. They are not really fundamental to their kits. They just kind of enhance what they want to do, what they're already doing. So in that sense, these are great balance tools, in my opinion, if we wanted to rethink how passives work. So with that being said, I think there's two ways that you could go about distributing these passives, right? Do you want to give characters that benefit the most, do you give characters the passives that they benefit the most from so that they enhance their game plan? Or would you give them some that they won't necessarily benefit too much from, but it also limits the amount of, damage or messing up the rest of their kit? So basically, what I'm trying to say here is that you can make it so that you make the characters more kind of like top heavy, so where their initial game plan is much better, right? So take Winston, for instance. I think this is a good example. If you give Winston knockback resistance, then his initial dive is going to be much better, right? And his way to get in, what he wants to do, get close to you, get in, and be there and take space and take aggro, right? It's going to be easier for him to do that. But if you get rid of the rest of the, like he doesn't have the headshot and he doesn't have the ult charge, his weaknesses are much more defined, right? If Winston doesn't play around his bubble correctly, then he's going to explode harder. If he doesn't posture correctly, he's going to explode harder. So the things that they don't necessarily do particularly well are punished harder than the things that they do well, right? Or you could not necessarily make the things that they do well much stronger, but you could enhance the things that they don't necessarily do as well, so that their weaknesses aren't like super like the characters are less one note, again, like less top heavy, right? So Winston, again, is a perfect example. Let's say he only had the tank headshot reduction, right? The skill and the fun of trying to find your way into the battle is hard, right? It is still like where it's you're going to struggle, right? Like you have to be skillful to get in that way. And there's a lot more counterplay to the things that the characters are good at. However, if those conditions are met and Winston successfully does get to the fight, now he gets to stay in the fight longer, right? His reward for getting through that part is better. Those are, in my opinion, the two ways that you could use these roles, right? That you could use these passives. And, I think in general, it's probably, I said, basically it comes down to, do you want to focus on counterplaying strengths or punishing weaknesses? That's where these two philosophies of balance come in. And you could use a mixture of them. Again, you could make up different passives that do other things. But in my opinion, that makes the game much more engaging, right? And it also gives different ways to play characters, and it just gives a lot more dynamics and returns a lot of those dynamics that we love about Overwatch, while also changing how characters play depending on it, right? Like, their general kit is still the same, but you could drastically change some play styles in certain ways because of these. Like, there's a lot you could do if you just kind of open up the idea that the passives do not have to be necessarily stacked onto roles. I know it is a bit radical, and one of the problems I have written down is it's probably going to be hard to keep track of who has what, because there could be a whole multitude of them. And of course, more passives could just overly complicate things. I could definitely see a scenario where the balance team just gives some character all of the passives, and then it's like, okay, well, what was the point of that? But that is kind of, we'll cross, if it were to happen, we cross that bridge when we get there, right? Hopefully we try to avoid those scenarios, at least the overly giving passives to one character. But before I go and wrap up, I do want to give you some new passive ideas, because it doesn't have to be limited to these passives, right? Like, they could add new ones. They could give a passive to 2 characters or something, right? If they really felt like it. Again, this could overly complicate things and be hard to keep track of, like, what passives are in the game. But I feel like, there's a lot more knobs, a lot more areas that you could choose, right? A couple of ideas I had written down. You could have the old DPS passives come back, so the reload speed or the speed after getting a kill. Both of those could come back. Those could benefit certain characters and help them out, while, being too good on certain other characters, right? General damage reduction instead of headshot damage. What if characters just took 10% less damage overall? That could definitely be something. Moira and Reaper already have a sort of Omnivamp built in, but what if they wanted to give other characters Omnivamp as well? That could help sustainability. There are certain characters that just kind of really suck at it. And also, before I continue, some of these passives I think don't work thematically with a lot of characters, and that's something that Blizzard should take into account. Like, you wouldn't just want to give, I don't know, would Bastion really get Omnivamp? Would that make any sense? You know what I mean? So you kind of do have to be careful of, like, not everything will work for every character, but it's just kind of like getting in the ballpark, right? They could have like a hard CC reduction, not immunity, but like, what if they're affected by stuns for less time, right? Same thing here. What if they're affected by debuffs for less time? What if certain characters didn't get hacked as long as others? What if certain characters didn't get antied as long as others? This would also, like, eliminate some of that frustration about, like, how Winston just kind of, like, ignores armor? Instead of it being just baked into Winston, what if it was a passive? Or, like, maybe he ignores a little bit of the armor, right? That other characters would be giving me, it's like, okay, this character ignores armor, I just know. Instead of just this one random, like, ability that's just there to give Winston something else to help him. The reason I say this is that, like, something like Sleep Dart, right? Sleep Dart on all tanks does less time, right? Instead of that, what if there was just, like, the hard CC reduction on most tank characters, and then maybe even some other characters, right? And then instead of it being this weird interaction where it only affects one role, it's just like, oh, their passive means that they are affected by this less. I feel like that feels better to play into and to counterplay more than just like, well, I slept the tank, but like the reward was less because they just, all tanks, it doesn't do as much. Basically, my whole point of this is that I don't think the role passives were a bad idea in theory. I think their execution has just been lacking, and they've been trying to use it more as band-aid solutions to fix roles, and in the meantime, it just makes certain individual characters suffer or too good, and there's really no good way around that because it's tied to the roles. If we loosen up the idea behind the passives, and maybe we remove a couple of them from certain characters, or we spread the love and put them other places, I feel like we'd be in a much healthier way and have a lot more tools for consistent good balance, rather than trying to balance these role passives around every single character because they have to have them, rather than like, what characters could have this passive, and now that we have those characters, we can remove some of them from the list, add some of them from the list, change the number from there. I feel like it would make things go by a lot easier and a lot more healthy overall. But that is going to do it from me. I want to hear what you guys think about this, because I think the role passives have been and will always be a very contentious topic for this community. What do you think about my ideas? What ideas do you have of your own? If you want to tell me about them, you go ahead and leave a comment, and while you're at it, like and subscribe as well. I do really appreciate it. If you want to tell me about any of your wacky suggestions, Overwatch stuff, rework ideas, hot takes, any of that, feel free to join the link to my Discord. It's in the description below. And this discussion was filmed live on Twitch. This one I didn't discuss with chat just because I wanted to get chat out of the way so you could see the whole graph and everything. But I do discussions every single time I go live, so there's always something to look forward to and talk to me directly. And with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. Have a good day.